Okay, so you want to own a golf course. Picture it. 200 acres of rolling green, members waving from golf carts, a clubhouse with a view, a bar that never closes before sundown, and your name on a small brass plaque by the first tee. You bought the dream. Rolling fairways, quiet mornings, a business that basically runs itself while wealthy members pay you every single month just for the privilege of showing up. That's the brochure. That's what the real estate listing photo is selling you. Here's what the listing doesn't show you. The irrigation pump that failed in July during the hottest month of the year on the fairway that gets the most complaints. The superintendent's payroll that goes out every 2 weeks whether it rained or not. The 17 members who quietly didn't renew this year because a newer club opened 20 minutes down the road. And the fact that in most parts of the country, there are more golf courses fighting for the same shrinking pool of golfers than at almost any point in the sport's history. Golf courses are one of the strangest business models in America. They require more land than almost any other commercial enterprise. They take years to build and decades to mature, and their entire product is essentially empty space that somebody has to mow every single day, whether anyone uses it or not. Some golf courses are genuinely excellent businesses. Some are slowly bleeding their owners dry while the clubhouse still looks full on a Saturday morning. And some don't survive at all. They get fenced off, left to rot, and eventually bulldozed for housing. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly which kind you're likely to be running, and why the golf course business is so much harder than it looks from the fairway. Before we get into money, we need to get one thing straight. Golf course is a word that covers about 5 completely different businesses that happen to share a scorecard. A municipal course is owned by a city or county, built for accessibility, and typically run at or near break-even on purpose. Its job is public recreation, not profit. A daily fee public course is privately owned and makes its money purely off green fees, cart rentals, and food and beverage, one round at a time, with no membership base to rely on. A semi-private club blends both. A smaller membership base for stable recurring income, plus public tee times to fill out the schedule. A private club runs almost entirely on membership dues and initiation fees, with green fees playing a minor role, and it's built around exclusivity rather than volume. And then there's the resort or destination course, which isn't really selling golf at all. It's selling a vacation experience, bundled with hotel rooms and priced accordingly. These are not the same business. A municipal course in Ohio and a private club in Scottsdale might both have 18 holes and a flagstick, but their entire financial structure, how they're funded, how they price, who their customer even is, has almost nothing in common. This script focuses primarily on the daily fee and private club models, the 2 most common paths for a new owner, while explaining where the others fit into the picture. The biggest single decision in golf course ownership isn't the clubhouse or the pro shop. It's whether you're building from raw land or buying an existing course, and the price difference between those 2 paths is enormous. Building a new 18-hole course from scratch typically requires 150 to 200 acres of land, and total development costs, land, design, earthwork, turf, irrigation, and clubhouse, generally run somewhere between $5 million and $15 million for a standard course, with premium and championship-level builds pushing well past $20 million. Land acquisition alone can account for 40 to 50% of that total budget, depending entirely on location. Rural land might run a few $1,000s an acre. Land near a growing suburb, where a golf course developer is competing with a housing developer for the same parcel, can run into the tens of thousands per acre. Then there's the construction itself. Greens need ultra-precise turf that can cost $8 to $12 per square foot installed, and with 18 greens averaging around 6,000 square feet each, that line item alone can clear $1 million before a single fairway is planted. Irrigation systems capable of watering 150-plus acres run $1 to $2.5 million. Earth moving and shaping the land runs another $1 to $3 million. Drainage alone can run $30,000 to $40,000 per hole. Buying an existing course is almost always the cheaper path up front, but that's exactly where new owners get into trouble, because not all existing courses are the same purchase. A course in a growing golf-hungry market with a strong membership base can sell for a healthy multiple of its revenue. A struggling course in an oversupplied market can sell for pennies on the dollar of what it costs to build,
because the buyer isn't really paying for the golf business. They're paying for the land underneath it and making a bet on what else that land might become.
Here's the part of golf course ownership that blindsides almost every new buyer: the course costs nearly the same to maintain whether 10 people play it or 200. According to industry cost benchmarks, average annual maintenance spending breaks down like this. Municipal courses spend around $620,000 a year, daily fee courses around $557,000, semi-private courses around $567,000, and private clubs, with their higher turf standards and more elaborate grounds, spend an average of $1,084,000 annually, and labor makes up roughly 56% of that entire budget. That labor isn't optional. A golf course superintendent and grounds crew mow greens daily, sometimes twice a day in peak season, at heights measured in fractions of an inch. Fairways get mowed several times a week. Bunkers need to be raked constantly. Irrigation heads fail and need replacing. Fertilizer and pest control programs run on a strict seasonal calendar because a single missed treatment can visibly damage a green for months. Then there's water, genuinely one of the largest and most volatile costs in the business, running anywhere from $100,000 to $300,000 annually depending on region and drought conditions, and in parts of the American Southwest, water rights and restrictions can single-handedly determine whether a course is viable at all. Add equipment, a fleet of specialized mowers, utility carts, and turf equipment running $500,000 to $1 million, replaced roughly every 5 to 7 years, plus a golf cart fleet, clubhouse utilities, insurance and property taxes, and you have a business with a full-time payroll and a 7-day-a-week maintenance schedule that runs regardless of how many rounds get played that month. This is the structural trap of golf course economics. Your biggest costs are fixed. Your revenue is not. The revenue side of a golf course is more layered than most people realize, and it comes from several different directions at once. Green fees are the most obvious layer. What a golfer pays to play a single round, ranging anywhere from $20 at a modest municipal course to $500 or more at a premium daily fee or resort course. This is pure volume math. Price times rounds played, and rounds played depends entirely on weather, season, and local competition. Membership dues and initiation fees are the second layer, and for private clubs, this is the real engine. Annual membership fees can range from $2,000 at a modest private club to well over $50,000 at an elite one, often on top of an initiation fee that can run into the tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars at the most exclusive clubs. This is the layer that gives a club predictable, recurring income that isn't dependent on daily weather, but it also means a club's entire financial health rests on retention. Lose members, and you don't just lose green fee revenue, you lose a locked-in annual check. Cart rentals are a surprisingly reliable third layer. Most courses charge per rider, and because carts have almost no marginal cost once purchased, this is close to pure profit per round. Food and beverage is the fourth layer, typically running a 20 to 30% markup, and at private clubs, many contracts require members to spend a minimum amount annually at the clubhouse restaurant and bar, guaranteeing revenue whether or not the member actually shows up to eat. And the fifth layer, often underestimated by new owners, is event hosting, tournaments, corporate outings, and weddings, which can book an entire course or clubhouse for a single day at a price far higher than the equivalent number of individual green fees, with far less wear on the course itself. A well-run course with all 5 layers working together, rounds, memberships, carts, food and beverage, and events, has a much smoother, more diversified income stream than a course relying purely on green fees. A course relying on green fees alone is essentially betting its entire year on the weather and the local economy cooperating week after week. Here's the risk that runs underneath the entire golf industry, and it's best explained through what actually happened to American golf course supply over the last 2 decades. Between 1986 and 2005, the U.S. golf industry went through a massive building boom. More than 4,500 new courses were added to the national supply, driven heavily by real estate developers who built golf courses primarily to sell the houses around them, not to run profitable golf businesses. The golf course was the amenity, the homes were the product, then the housing bubble burst in the mid-2000s, and the golf market followed it down. Starting in 2006, annual course closures began outnumbering new openings for the first time since the Great Depression, and they kept outnumbering openings for the better part of the next 2 decades. In total, the U.S. golf course supply shrank by roughly 13% from its peak, a net loss of well over 1,600 courses. The mechanism behind each individual closure is almost always the same story playing out at a smaller scale. A course built during the boom, in a market that couldn't ultimately support it, slowly losing members and rounds to newer or better located competition, unable to cover its fixed maintenance costs on shrinking revenue, until the owner either sells at a steep loss, defaults on debt, or simply shuts the gates. And once a course closes, reopening it is far harder than it sounds. Turf that isn't maintained reverts to overgrown brush within a single season. Irrigation systems left dry corrode and fail, and clubhouses left empty become targets for vandalism and theft. A closed golf course doesn't sit in stasis waiting for a new buyer. It actively deteriorates, and the cost to bring it back online can rival the cost of building a new one from scratch. To see how this plays out in the real world, look at the Silverstone golf course in northwest Las Vegas. Silverstone was a 27-hole course built as the centerpiece of a residential community. Homes constructed around it, an HOA formed with deed restrictions requiring the land to remain a golf course. The exact model that drove the building boom of the 1990s and early 2000s. In September 2015, a California investor took ownership of the course and immediately closed it. He put up a chain-link fence around the property and shut off the water. 3 days after selling the shuttered course to another buyer that December, that new buyer filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on the holding company he'd used to purchase it. What followed was nearly a decade of exactly the deterioration pattern golf courses fall into once maintenance stops. The boarded-up clubhouse was destroyed in a fire suspected to be arson. The turf died and reverted to scrubland. The property became a magnet for trespassers. The owner filed for bankruptcy a second time, battling in court with the surrounding homeowners association, which wanted the deed restriction enforced and the course restored, while the owner argued the restriction made the property financially unworkable and pushed for permission to redevelop part of it into housing instead. The bankruptcy case was ultimately dismissed. The legal fight over the deed restriction went nowhere for years, and the course sat closed, fenced, and decaying for nearly a decade before finally being sold at a trustee auction in 2025. Its outgoing owner calling the entire experience, in his own words, a nightmare. That's the mechanism in miniature. A course closes for financial reasons. The deed restrictions and HOA covenants that were supposed to protect the community instead trap the land in limbo. Nobody can afford to run it as a golf course, and nobody is legally allowed to turn it into anything else. The building doesn't fail because golf is dying everywhere. It fails because one piece, in this case an owner who couldn't or wouldn't fund operations, comes out and the entire structure underneath it, land use, community expectations, financing, was quietly built to depend on that piece staying in place. Here's the part that makes golf course economics genuinely interesting right now. The 2-decade correction described above appears to be ending. Annual course closures have fallen for 5 consecutive years, dropping to their lowest levels in roughly 2 decades. The ratio of golfers to golf courses, a key measure of whether supply and demand are balanced, has returned to where it was before the 1990s building boom. New course openings and new course development have both climbed to their highest levels in over a decade, with more than 140 new courses in planning or under construction at the start of 2026, concentrated heavily in Florida, Texas, and South Carolina. In other words, the courses that survived the correction are, on average, in meaningfully better financial shape than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Less oversupply means less brutal competition for the same golfers. A renewed surge in participation has allowed operators to raise green fees and membership dues for the first time in years. The industry hasn't stopped closing courses entirely. Some annual attrition is normal for any small business, and land near growing cities will always tempt owners toward a lucrative sale to a housing developer instead. But the wild oversupply that doomed courses like Silverstone has largely worked its way out of the system. The good year. You own a well-located daily fee course with a modest membership program layered on top. Rounds played are strong thanks to a mild season and no major competing course nearby. Green fees, cart rentals, a full event calendar of corporate outings and weddings, and steady food and beverage spending combined for healthy total revenue. Your maintenance costs stayed within budget because water was plentiful and you didn't lose any major equipment. Membership renewals came in above 90%. You end the year with a real operating profit, and the property itself has likely appreciated as the surrounding area continues to develop. The bad year. A drought forces water restrictions that limit irrigation right in peak season, and your greens visibly suffer, which immediately shows up in fewer rounds booked and members quietly not renewing. A newer built course opens 20 minutes away and pulls a meaningful share of your daily fee traffic. Your irrigation system, now over a decade old, has a major pump failure midsummer, an unbudgeted six-figure repair. Membership retention drops. Fixed maintenance costs barely move because the grass still needs cutting whether 10 people play the course or 200. You end the year with a loss, and depending on how leveraged you are, that loss can compound quickly. Because unlike a retail business, you can't simply shrink your footprint to cut costs. The course is the size it is. The gap between those 2 years isn't intelligence or effort. It's weather, local competition, and how exposed your fixed costs are to a bad season. 3 things a course owner can plan around but never fully control. So does owning a golf course actually work as a business? The honest answer is, it depends enormously on which course, in which market, bought at which point in the supply cycle. And the gap between the good outcome and the bad outcome is as wide as almost any business you'll find. The romance of golf course ownership is real. There's something genuinely different about owning 200 acres of maintained green space instead of a storefront or an office suite. But the mechanics underneath that romance are unforgiving. Fixed costs that don't care how many people show up, land that takes years to mature into a mature, playable course, and a business where your product, literally, empty space and mowed grass, has to be maintained to a precise standard every single day, whether anyone plays a single round or not. The owners who make it work aren't the ones who fell in love with the view. They're the ones who understood, going in, that they weren't really buying a golf course. They were buying 200 acres of land with an extremely specific, extremely expensive set of conditions attached to keeping it green,